Welcome to Inside Independence, a show about interesting events and people and information in Clarkston, Independence Township. The show is under the production of the Independence Cable Studio here at the high school. And today I'm going to be speaking with Arsey Miller, a resident of our community and a veteran of the Vietnam War. Arsey, you might have met Arsey somewhere at Clarkston United Methodist Church, or you'll see him at the 4th of July parade. He has a Model A, and he has, he's part of the Model A Club, and you have the telephone truck, 1931 telephone truck. He's also been a speaker for students at Clarkston Junior High on the Vietnam War, as well as the Daughters of the American Revolution. But I think the greatest thing is to share the history of the Vietnam War with the students, right. And have the classes talking to you, and they honored you with an award this spring, and we're extremely happy to have you here today. And I'm asking Arsey to share some experiences as a soldier in Vietnam and a veteran as we honor the 50th anniversary of the war. And so welcome.
Thank you.
And I thought it's important that we talk a little bit about the background of the war. 2.7 million men and women served in country, meaning that they were actually in Vietnam during the war. And the war started in 1955, but you know, there were just a few people under President Eisenhower and President Kennedy. 1965 was the big buildup of American troops in Vietnam. War was about 8 years long. I believe it was 1968, there was a 500,000 soldiers in Vietnam. That was a lot, that's a lot of soldiers.
Right.
Today there's less than 850,000 veterans left. That's about 30% of the veterans that were stationed. And their median age is 71 years old, meaning that there's as many older and as many younger. And you know, statistics, it's very hard because most of the soldiers we're looking at are pretty close to 75, I think.
I would think so, yeah.
I mean,
I was late in the war. I mean, I served in country in the year 1971, and you know, I mean, I'm 70 plus today, so.
Yeah. So thank you for joining us today. So take us back to, you know, when you were in high school, and what were your plans after high school?
You know, obviously it was a different time. When I was in high school, it was, you know, I mean, there were still a lot of trades, there were a lot of things going on. College was not as heavily pushed as it is today. And so, you know, I really, you know, like many people, didn't have a lot of plans like kids do today, you know. I mean, it was, you know, basically
I'm going to do something.
Get out of school, you know, get a job, do this, do that. So, you know, live the American dream.
Yeah. So what did you know? I mean, so do you remember knowing anything about the Vietnam War? Because the war had been going on for like 5 years or so.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you know, when I was a freshman in high school, you know, Kennedy was shot that fall. You know, and he had started some, you know, there were advisors, quote unquote, in Vietnam during his tenure. And then when Johnson came in, really, like you said, 74, 75, the war really, 64, 65, I'm sorry, the war really escalated.
Yeah.
You know, and at that point, you know, you started to become more aware of, you know, I mean, if you were a male of 17, 18, you started to become more aware of the draft, you know.
Yeah, that's draft. So for those people who don't know, you had a lottery number, right?
Yeah, I mean, from the early 60s to probably 68, there were a lot of deferments. The draft was, you know, however fair or unfair it was, but you know, early on, if you were married and had a child, you were deferred, and this, you had a deferment for this. There were school deferments. And in 1968, I believe, they decided to have a lottery draft. And in that case, every day of the year was put in, and they were randomly selected. And so whatever your number was, that's where your position was in the draft. It eliminated a lot of the deferments, and my number was 16, so I knew pretty early on that, you know, I was going to be in the draft.
Okay. So tell us about when you found out that you won the lottery.
Yeah.
Different kind of lottery, but.
Absolutely. You know, I mean, it was, you know, it was a reality of life, you know, I mean, and I knew having a very low number that my number would be up pretty fast. I mean, so I was drafted, the lottery I think was 69, not 68, but I was drafted on the 3rd of January, 1970.
Okay.
So the lottery went into effect the 1st of January, so it didn't take long. And in retrospect, I guess, you know, it was perhaps better to have the low number, because there were many people in probably the 200 and 250 range that, you know, they were still at the end of the year right up against being drafted, and I already had a year in. You know, I mean, the draft was a 2-year commitment, where an enlistment was a 3 to 4 year commitment.
So, tell us about your journey there. It wasn't a trip that most people would want to take at that time.
Yeah, I mean, you know, it started, you know, when I was drafted, I went to Fort Campbell, Kentucky for basic training, which was an interesting 6 or 7 weeks, whatever it was, because, you know, you have so many people from so many different, you know, ethnic backgrounds, economic backgrounds, and so you've got to basically make them unified. You have to make them the same. And so, you know, it's essentially breaking everyone down to rock bottom and then building them back up. I mean, I remember, you know, at some point in the 4th week or something, they finally referred to you almost mistakenly as a soldier, you know, and that was a big thing, you know, because up until that you hadn't been called many positive things.
Well, and I think some of those sergeants at the time were actually former World War II soldiers.
Yeah, I think a lot of the people I had were World War II. You know, Korean. There were a lot of Korean veterans.
Yeah, veteran. I mean,
you know.
they were active duty soldiers, but they were the sergeants who had been through maybe a war and maybe understood the piece. So I know at some point you were offered officer candidate school.
Yeah, after, you know, during AIT, which is Advanced Infantry Training, when I graduated from basic training, I was assigned 11C, which was mortars infantry, and all infantry, or the majority of infantry people, went to Fort Polk, Louisiana, birthplace of combat veterans for Vietnam, the sign said. Okay. And so when I was there, they encouraged me several times to, you know, to enlist for a longer period of time and go to OCS, Officer Candidate School.
Because you'd have to extend your...
I'd have to extend, and my reply was, you know, you can make me a 5-star general, but you got 2 years to do it.
Okay.
You know? So at the very end of AIT, when orders were about to come out, and probably 98% of the people that were at Fort Polk went to Vietnam, at the very end they said, okay, how about non-commissioned officer candidate school? And I said, 2 years? They said, 2 years. So I continued on, went to Fort Benning and went to non-com.
And that's for the viewers, that's basically sergeant.
Yes.
From, it was like first sergeant or sergeant up to...
Yeah, E5 through E9. So
up to sergeant general, or sergeant major.
Command sergeant major, yeah. So, you know, I went through, which gave me a year in the States. And then when I did go to Vietnam, I had 1 year left. So I ETS'd right out of Vietnam. My
Okay.
time was over.
ETS meaning end of term of service,
Yes,
right? Or
yeah,
something like
right,
that?
yeah.
Yeah. So you're on your way to Vietnam, second year of your 2-year enlistment. And tell us when you got there, kind of what you saw and what your duties were.
Yeah, when we arrived in Vietnam, there were 12 of us that had been together since day one. And we'd been through basic together, we'd been through AIT together, we'd been through officer or non-commissioned officer candidate school together. And you arrive in Saigon, they put you in a large formation and then just call out names and numbers. And the first afternoon, 11 of the 12 of us that had been together since day one were called, and they all went to the 1st Cav. I stayed there for another 2 days and was called to go to 101st Airborne in Phu Bai, which when I landed, you know, the word on the street was the worst place to be, Phu Bai. You know, so I was off to Phu Bai.
How lucky you,
yeah,
yes.
You know, off to Phu
I
Bai.
could see how you might think, oh.
Yeah, off to Phu Bai and, you know, landed, went to Echo Company, which Echo Company is the support company. You know, light field artillery, mortars, reconnaissance, that's all generally in Echo Company. Alpha, Bravo, Charlie, Delta, usually rifle line companies. So when I went there, I was originally, you know, my first duties were as a forward observer for a reconnaissance platoon. So, you know, 6, 7 guys, we'd get in a helicopter and go out and just listen to what's going on, you know.
Listen and see, right, or view, or
Listen to see. I mean, you had to gauge your proximity because you know there are only
there's
6 or 7
yeah,
of them.
okay.
You know, I mean, you know the
so
good
would they
news.
take you there and then land and then?
Oh yeah.
And
You
then,
get in a helicopter.
then you're
and,
6
yeah.
or 7 on the ground.
Yeah,
right?
6 or 7 on the ground. We usually were out for 2 or 3 days. You know, and basically we were just observing what was going on. We were listening. You know, my whole time in Vietnam, I was always very close to the DMZ. I don't think I was ever more than about 10 kilometers from the DMZ.
And the DMZ was a dividing line?
It was the demilitarized zone.
That was North
North Vietnam,
and
South
Vietnam. Okay.
Yeah. So we were up there basically trying to track, you know, the People's Army of the North coming south. You know, bringing resupply,
okay.
that kind of stuff. You know, our purpose was never to engage. You know, I mean, because we just, you know, there were so few of us. So that was the origin. That was my original responsibility. Then I basically, from that point on, my home base, Camp Eagle, was the home base for the 101st, but I was pretty much always on an OP called Checkmate.
So that is a mountain?
Mountaintop.
Okay.
Yep.
And you said a little bit, I remember you saying when you spoke to a group I was in, that it was better to not be in on a base and be out a little bit.
Yeah.
So talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, for me, I mean, everybody's day was different, you know, so everybody had their own opinions. But for me, you know, being on the fire base, I mean, the fire Camp Eagle or even the fire base Bastogne, which was our closest bigger base, you know, they had been there for so long. They were so, you know, because you had so many people from the community, you know, the Vietnamese that would come in and do anything from, you know, barber shops to cleaning the hooches to working at the PX, and some of them were, you know,
sympathetic to
sympathetic. That's
to
a
the
good
north,
term.
yeah.
Sympathetic to the north. So pretty much the fire bases and Camp Eagle, I mean, they knew where every inch of it was. They wanted to drop, you know, mortars or lay artillery or come through the wire. They knew exactly where to go. In the jungle or on an OP, it was much harder.
OP meaning operational post?
Yeah, right. Yeah, or an LP listening post, you know, depending.
Well, so there, people can see, the idea of that. So,
Well, the other point was when you were in Camp Eagle, you were supposed to have pressed fatigues. You were not supposed to carry a weapon.
oh, okay.
And I'm sitting there saying, has the enemy got these same rules, and so I rarely stayed there. I mean, if I had to stay there overnight, it was a long night for me.
Oh, okay. Well, that's really, I mean, for many of us, we knew about the war. We
Right.
didn't know about the terrain
Right.
necessarily. We didn't really know, when the movies came out, that gave us a little glimpse of what life might have been like
Right.
in Vietnam. So what other things other things that, I mean, you had a year there. I mean, it's probably a long year.
Yeah, it was it probably seemed longer at the time.
Yeah.
I mean, I was always, because of the mortars, I was always, quote unquote, more of a support person. I mean, if we were on the OP, we were basically there, and we would support line companies, rifle companies, that were working around the area. Where we were up north, it was very mountainous.
So you would fire, would you get, would you get a number, or I wouldn't say numbers, and then you would fire?
Yeah, basically, I mean, if you had a good forward observer in the field, they'd call in. Usually it was suspected enemy activity. I mean, that was our general call. So they'd call in basic grid coordinates. I mean, all the forward observers had pretty good maps. If you were good at reading the terrain maps, you were pretty accurate. So they'd call in suspected enemy locations. Sometimes they'd call in actual contact. So, my role at that point, I was in 11C40, which was chief computer. So, I would, if mortars had a big wheel and it had a line on it, so you could pick a location,
Okay.
and then you would set the guns to that area and then fire. You'd usually fire a proximity round to make sure, proximity being burst in the air, to make sure you weren't right on top of
your own troops.
Your own troops.
Because that was a problem,
It
I
was a
think.
problem sometimes, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately.
Well, it was a bigger problem for the forward observers because they didn't know where they were.
Oh.
And sometimes it was hard. I mean, you were in triple canopy jungle. I mean, and it was hard to see if there was anything that was, a hilltop or a stream or something that you could use as a reference point to confirm. So a lot of times, you'd purposely fire a couple of proximity HE Quicks or Willie Peters white phosphorus, just so either visually you could see where they were or you could hear where they were and kind of fix your location. But the downside of that was that usually the Vietnamese had the same ability. So, they'd look at that, and if you fired 3, you triangulated yourself, it was not a good day.
Oh, then then I know where you are.
Exactly,
Okay.
exactly.
Yeah. So, did you have any strategies or any characteristics that you that helped you get through the war? I mean, bravery, courage comes from being there in the moment and having to do things. There's no choices, I think.
Right.
Yeah,
it's hard to say you had a strategy because, I mean, for the most part, you were not in control of your destiny. I mean, you didn't know from one day to the next what your next duty assignment was going to be. So, I mean, my strategy was when I landed in Vietnam, probably 100 feet from the plane, I turned around and said, "Be back here next year," because I'm walking right back up that ramp. And that
so that was a goal. I mean, it was a goal, and it was.
Yeah.
A truly visual goal for you.
Absolutely. And so, I think for me, it's whether it was there or whether today. I'm firmly of the philosophy, right foot, left foot, right foot, left foot. You know, I mean, just keep moving
moving.
forward.
Yeah.
Keep moving forward.
So, was there anything that changed your life in Vietnam, you think, other than the total experience? I mean,
I would say if there were any life-changing experiences, it was one, how fragile life itself is. You know, I mean, when we're in community, you know, we see devastation by weather, or we see a car crash or something like that, but it's generally not as frequent. But you know, I mean, if you're in a combat situation, you know,
daily, hourly, whatever.
could be by the minute. You know, I mean, it's hard to say, but you see how fragile life is. And the other thing I think is you see, particularly if you're in a combat situation, you see how little you can live on. I mean, for the most part, I lived out of a rucksack for a year. I didn't have a refrigerator, I didn't have a microwave. I mean, we barely got brown bags, which were hot meals that would come out from, you know, from a fire base or a base camp. You know, almost all my food was either sea rations, or towards the middle of my tour, they started to have some LRRPs, which were long-range reconnaissance. It was the first freeze-dried food.
Oh, okay.
You know, so you add hot water.
Add
And
hot-
it was
and
definitely more tasty, you know.
Then a sea ration.
Yeah, sea rations were, you know, some of the cans were packed, you know, 4 or 5 years after I was born, you know, and we're eating them in Vietnam. So, yeah, but you know, it taught you a lot about the fragileness of life and how little you really need to exist, and how you can go on. You know, I meet people all the time, and they say, "Well, I could never do that," but you could. If you have to, you could.
Yeah, I think if you're in the position, that's,
Yeah.
you know, it's live or die.
Right.
I mean, that's basically
Right.
the, you know, and we're very glad that you made it through. So, just a little bit, you know, many people we've talked about when people came back home. They were not necessarily Vietnam soldiers were not really treated well, and that tended to be by younger people, I think, not older people. But I don't really. I mean, that's my view, because at the time it was more the younger people were protesting, but there was, you know, there was all ages, but
Right.
a majority of younger people.
Yeah, no, when I came back, I mean, if you back up a little bit, you know, I mean, in 1968, the Tet Offensive, where the Viet Cong and the People's Army of the North really made monumental strides. They showed the vulnerability of the ARVN, the Army of the South Vietnamese, and to a limited extent the American Army. Then through 69 and 70, you know, I mean, we're basically in Vietnam, and we're watching very remotely, you know, the trial of William Calley. You know,
And My Lai was the biggest atrocity Americans.
Exactly.
I mean, we were responsible for My Lai.
Right. You know, so we're basically there trying to follow orders, and Calley's convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison. Later commuted by Nixon, but still. So, you know, then you come home, and yeah, I mean, I was encouraged by my family, you know, not to even wear my uniform when I flew from Fort Lewis back to Chicago. The Vietnam, or the VFW for the most part, the American Legion for the most part, were not welcoming of Vietnamese or Vietnam era soldiers. So that's why the Vietnam Veterans of America was founded, for these guys to have some place to go.
Yeah, that's very interesting. When I read that, it's like Veterans of Foreign Wars is really only for men and women who fought in foreign wars, or
right.
not for people who served, say, in the United States,
Right.
or
Yeah, you have to have a campaign ribbon
yeah.
from a foreign war conflict.
And so I read that and I was like, oh, that's very interesting,
Yeah.
you know, because all of those people in the VFW were veterans.
Yeah, absolutely.
And
And many of them fathers of Vietnam soldiers.
right.
Yeah, so.
And I think that is family lines where, in family lines where fathers, sons, you know, have fought since the Revolution or
Right.
before that, really
Right.
even. So that certainly has turned around, I hope.
Absolutely. I mean, the VFW now, if it weren't for Vietnam veterans, their halls would be empty.
Well,
I mean, we
yeah.
pull, you know, we're the lion's share of what the Vietnam. Now, some of the Afghan and the Middle East people are starting to take positions of importance, which is good. But again, you know, we talked a little earlier, you know, most of the veterans, I think because of life in general, they don't participate in the VFW or the American Legion because they're busy, and it's unfortunate. And I was the same way because, you know, when they need it most, probably they're not active.
Yes, probably in those, because there's a lot of veterans benefits that the actual soldier veteran may or may not know about, but an organization has a better handle on it, or has somebody that can help you
Right.
maneuver through those.
Yeah, that's one part of it. I mean, the VA and, you know, every VFW, and I assume the American Legion has the same. I'm not a member of the Legion, but they all have service officers that will help you navigate whatever needs to be navigated. But the bigger part is, you know, I mean, I do a lot of stuff now with the VFW, particularly on the Honor Guard, but you're sitting there and you spend 6 hours with guys that have been there. You know, you don't have to watch what you say.
Comrades.
You know, they understand whether it's your pain or your pleasure. They understand where you've been,
Well,
what
that
you've done.
supports your mental health.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, there's
absolutely.
the other people are thinking what you're thinking.
Yeah.
So talk about you're a member of the North Oakland Veterans of Foreign Wars
That's correct.
chapter
Right.
in Oxford, is that correct?
Yeah, Oxford.
Okay. But I know that monthly you perform a duty that everybody appreciates, so you and others.
Right.
But so tell us about that.
Yeah, like I said, I've been a life member for the VFW since 1972, I think, and not really actively involved. A couple of things got me more actively involved. Mostly, I went to 3 funerals, my father's, my uncle's, and a good friend of mine, and they were all veterans, and the Honor Guard was just so-so. I felt bad, you know, because to me, honor, you know, it says something. It says something about how you conduct yourself, how you present yourself. And so I was somewhere and I saw the Honor Guard from, probably the Lake Orion Veteran Memorial, which is a beautiful place. And I was there for something, and the Honor Guard was there, and I saw how well they presented themselves, how dedicated they were to the honor, and that's really why I went to that post. So once I got on, I joined the Honor Guard, and the 3rd Tuesday of every month, we go to the National Cemetery in Holly.
Great Lakes National Cemetery.
And then we're there all day. So we'll do anywhere from half a dozen, maybe 10 funerals with
Services.
honors. Yeah. So, you know, where we do the 3 volley salute, the taps, and, you know, occasionally we have to fold the flag and that kind of stuff. So, I mean, I take it very personally. I mean, it's an honor. Just for my own peace of mind and maybe some therapeutic value.
Yes, it is a wonderful last honor for
It is,
those
absolutely.
people, and they all. I think there's 11. About 10 or 20 years ago, there was 11% of Americans had been in the service. They were
Right.
veterans.
Right.
Today, that's down to about 7%.
Right.
And due to lack of draft and we don't, the amount of people, we have less than 1%, 1% in the Army today.
Right.
I mean, though, you know, we have less than 1% of the population
Right.
is in the Army just today. Though, you know, we have to think we've got 100,000 people in Europe right now. That's a lot of or men and women. So there are a lot of soldiers, but
Right.
We are losing them. We've almost lost all of our World War II veterans.
Yeah,
Korean
very few.
War veterans are, I mean, the World War II veterans are 100 years old or 98, something like that. World War II, I'm sorry, Korean War veterans are in their 90s.
Right.
And the Vietnam veterans are in their 70s.
Well, some of the first.
And there were people that served all the way through. I mean, we
Right.
didn't, it's not just at wartime.
Right.
So,
Yeah. No, it's yeah, it is a situation, and that's one of the things where, again, you know, we honor, and right now at the National Cemetery, you know, we get some Korean, every once in a while a World War II vet, but a lot of Vietnam veterans. But, you know, we do, after the flag is presented to the family, we usually present brass, which is the 3 shells from the volley. And when I started doing this, you know, I opened one of the packets and they were corroded and so I hand polish every shell we give away. You know, it's just, it's for me, you know, it's not for the families so much as it is for
well, I think
me.
it's important.
Yeah.
It's important that we do, I mean, it's an honor.
It is an
It's
honor. It is an honor.
And, you know, whether you were a cook, whether you were a rifleman, you were there.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, and that kind of realization just really hit me the last couple of years. You know, I mean, when you're a combat soldier, you're a combat soldier. You know, I mean, you're out there, you know, taking and receiving, and you know, it's different. And you know, in the service, there's names that aren't necessarily good names for people that are not in combat positions. But you know, I talk to some of my fellow veterans now, and I say, you know, I had the same feelings. You know, I mean, but now, you know, I did want to eat.
Yeah, that's
I
true.
did need ammo. I did need water. So my view of those non-combative
Well, it's
people,
like a little, yes, it all goes together.
it all goes together. I
And you
mean,
need you
yeah,
need those backup people too,
absolutely.
yes.
And the other thing, I just read a book called Dust Child, and it was a book about the Amerasian children. And a lot of the things when I was reading it was, you know, the hardships that it put on the people of Vietnam, you know, the citizens of Vietnam, and I don't know that many veterans ever think about that.
That's probably true. Wherever war is, whether it was the Civil War, the American Revolution,
Right.
World War II, the people who were just living
Yeah.
in those battleground places didn't ask for it,
Yeah,
didn't really maybe know all
Yeah.
about it, but
exactly.
their life was changed.
Yeah, I mean, you look at the Ukraine now. I mean, you know, all the people that, you know, these apartment buildings that are
Right.
just demolished. You know,
Yeah.
I mean, yesterday I was watering the plants on the deck. Today there's no deck. You know,
Yeah.
so yeah, and that book kind of opened my eyes to that a little bit.
And it's called
Dust Child. Yeah, it's an
okay.
interesting read.
Well, that's interesting. So I want to thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and your remembrances, good and bad.
Yeah.
And I hope that everyone will remember each day the veterans who have served our nation, those who are still here and those who have left us. And March 29th is the day after the war was over, and it's a day to remember the Vietnam veterans, and we appreciate your time. Thank you.